You're listening to Vote Her In, a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. On today's episode, we speak with Tina Tchen, President and CEO of Time's Up. Hi, everyone. This is Kelly, and you're listening to Vote Her In. This is, of course, a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Today, we are all coming from Chicago, but, of course, are sequestered in our own houses. So, once again, broadcasting from quarantine. So, I am now going to turn it over to Rebecca, who will introduce our guest. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Kelly. I'm glad to be here in these troubled times. But as we were discussing just now, we think it's just so important to keep sharing the information and the stories here at Voter In, and to help ourselves and other women just keep on moving and do what we can to keep making this world a better place, however difficult that may be at this moment. And in that context, I can't think of a better person for us to be interviewing than Tina Tchen. Many of you may know her as having been Chief of Staff for First Lady Michelle Obama. She and I started out back in the day with the honor of working for another great Chicagoan, Harold Washington, first Black mayor of Chicago. And one of the treats of that time that continues is figuring out, well, here are the issues we need to work on. Here's what we need to do next. And Tina has just come to the fore since then, both locally, nationally, internationally. And she's going to share with us today some of her thoughts about her current work and her path to it and what she sees coming up. So with that, welcome, Tina. And we're glad you're here. Tina, if you would, why don't we start by your sharing with us how you got going on this path and what's kept you going and motivated, and what you see will keep you on this path going forward.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to both you and to Kelly for having me on, especially at this moment, and I hope that you all and everybody listening, you and your families are safe and healthy during this time. And Rebecca, you're right, you and I go way back to Harold Washington days, and that's a lot about where my story starts, is that I got to Illinois. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, the daughter of two immigrant parents from China. They're really, these days, I actually describe them because they were as refugees. They were refugees from, the war in China, after World War II that came in 1949. And I grew up outside of Cleveland, Ohio, in the suburbs there. In part because my dad decided that, he heard from friends and family that the high concentrations of Chinese in the coasts in New York and San Francisco were experiencing a lot of discrimination. So as I often say, he decided to raise us where there were no Chinese at all, which was, the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio in the 50s and 60s. And, from there, I got started on this path really right after college. I got married after college to a guy from Chicago. That's how I wound up in Illinois in 1978, working in Springfield for state government. But it was during a time, as you'll remember, Rebecca, when, Illinois, and Springfield, Illinois in particular, was the hotbed of American feminism. Much to, I think, people's surprise now, but it was at a time when we were trying to get, the Equal Rights Amendment passed, and Illinois was the only northern industrial state that had not ratified the ERA at that time. And so everybody was focused. All the national, women's rights groups were here in Illinois, and we were doing marches, and people were, there were nuns on hunger strikes. And it was a very heady time for me in my, 20s at that point to get exposed to that level of activity. I became an officer with the National Organization for Women, but it really was my exposure in depth and right away to the fight for women's equality, and became, a lifelong fight for me as I proceeded, then after that work to become a lawyer, and then working for a corporate law firm, and then moving my way into politics as well. And, always working on women's politics and gender equity issues.
My mother grew up in Parma, Ohio in the 50s and 60s. So other side of Cleveland.
The other side, on the west side.
Yeah.
The west side.
But yeah, no, it's a very familiar area to me. I wanted to sort of then talk some about your experience with the White House Council on Women and Girls and working with First Lady Michelle Obama and with Valerie Jarrett to talk about the priorities for women, for girls, how to make sure they got the attention from the federal government and how that led then to the work you're doing now.
Yeah, well, one of the things, and Rebecca knows this, what we do in Chicago is politics is sort of, the true full-time hobby for many of us, and it's sort of like a full contact sport often. And, as Rebecca and I got to know each other doing political work for people like Harold Washington and other candidates and doing things like voting rights projects for women, along the way, but long enough ago that the three of us can't remember when we first met, I wound up meeting a guy, named Barack Obama and his wife, Michelle Obama, and always supported him through his campaigns, for state Senate and for U.S. Senate. And then was obviously very active in his presidential campaign, which probably was the first campaign, certainly the first campaign I ever went to the Iowa caucuses myself to work, which was an experience. And when that was all over, he asked, me to join the administration and go to the White House. And, even though, I was a practicing lawyer in a firm that I loved, and my kids, one kid was in college and one kid was still in middle school, happily settled here in Chicago. When the president of the United States asks you to do something, it doesn't happen very often. And you, of course, say yes. And so he and Valerie asked me to come in and work for Valerie, who was his senior advisor for public engagement and intergovernmental affairs. So she had two separate offices, and I ran the Office of Public Engagement and worked, and ran that for the first 2 years. My counterpart was Cecilia Munoz, who ran the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. And that was where I first started. So, we kind of walked into the, White House, right after the inauguration to set these offices up. And along the way, Valerie and I both knew that we wanted to work on women and girls issues. In fact, when she asked me to do the Office of Public Engagement, which was the president's outreach office, I told her I would do it so long as I was able to keep women and girls outreach for myself, because it's something I was deeply invested in and wanted to continue to do. And so in the early weeks of the administration, we worked with the president and decided that we would, instead of creating a new White House Office for Women and Girls policy, which had existed during the Clinton administration, we wanted to try a different tack and actually create a White House Council on Women and Girls that would include all of the White House policy offices and all of the cabinet agencies. So really basically the entire federal government, their leadership being members of the White House Council on Women and Girls, because we didn't want their, as important as it would have been to have just an office for women and girls policy, we wanted each federal agency to own the issue of addressing women and girls. And the president said that on March 9th of 2009, when he signed that executive order and said, every part of the federal government will touch the lives of women and girls in some way. And we want every part of the federal government's leadership to be thinking about that every day. And, and how are you going to better the lives of women and girls? How are you touching the lives with what you're doing with your policies and programs? And, I was the executive director for all 8 years, and Valerie was the chair for all 8 years. And, I think we did some amazing work, with all of our fellow agencies, both each individual agency placing women and girls at the top, places like the Department of Transportation, for example, who did some amazing work. But then also collectively, like holding the first ever White House Summit on Working Families, which we did in 2010, I think. And then, our concluding event, which was the United States of Women Summit, which we held the first one in 2016, which brought together all of the issues, domestic and international, and all of the organizations and grassroots activists who are working on women's education and women's economy and health and violence against women together in one moment, so everyone could connect with one another, celebrate the work that we had done in the Obama administration, and lay the groundwork for the future, because we actually, Valerie and I, have kept the United State of Women going through the UnitedStateOfWomen.org, which still exists to this day, and is still bringing together women across issues at the grassroots level throughout the country.
So one of the things, of course, unfortunately, that keeps on going is harassment of women, along with the other challenges we face on the pay front and in our healthcare. Can you talk a bit about how, the path that went from the White House to realizing that you really wanted to step up into a leadership role to combat harassment and to lead the Time's Up effort?
Well, a lot of that, Rebecca, is sort of like the coincidence of right place, right time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I knew coming out of the White House in January of 2017 was one of the things I had learned, apart from putting together the White House Summit on Working Families, was that there were a lot of companies out there that wanted to start doing right by their women workers, wanted to address things like equal pay and paid leave, but didn't know how to do it. And, they really didn't know what the tools were. And a lot of times it was their own lawyers, for example, who were saying, well, don't do that equal pay study, right? Because we don't want to generate the data that shows we got an equal pay problem. So when I decided I wanted to go back to a private practice in 2017, I thought there was a market there to actually build a practice that would help companies rebuild their workplace culture. So I joined a law firm, Buckley, LLP, and I'm grateful the partners there gave me the ability to build a workplace culture practice. I will tell you that I started that practice in September of 2017. About 3 weeks before the first Harvey Weinstein article appeared, right? So that's why right place, right time. Because, and I'll be honest, I was wondering a little bit during those first 3 weeks, well, I think this is a good idea. Now, how am I going to get people to hire me? And then the first Harvey Weinstein articles appeared in the New York Times and the New Yorker. And all of a sudden the phone stopped, couldn't stop ringing around companies needing help, right, on how to address sexual harassment. Mm-hmm. And more than that, not just how to investigate bad things that had happened, but how would they really address it proactively for the future, right, and build better workplaces. And then in another right place, right time, I happened to be in Hollywood in about another 3 weeks later after the articles appeared, meeting with some folks that I had met during my White House years in LA. And Michelle Kidley at CAA pulled me into her office and told me about this group of women in Hollywood who had started spontaneously meeting with one another in the wake of those articles. And these were women who, up until the articles appeared, really thought they had been alone in experiencing what Harvey did to so many women, and only then just realized for the first time they had a shared pain. And they were getting together to talk about that, but to their credit, very quickly realized they wanted to turn their pain into action. And they wanted that action to be not just for themselves. They recognized quickly they were women of privilege and they had a platform, and they wanted to do something that would actually reach, the thousands of women workers in low-wage jobs, in the restaurant industry, in the hospitality industry, in the farm workers, who were sort of suffering without any resources. And that's when we came up with the idea of Time's Up. It's a name that was born. Mm-hmm. Rashida Jones and Kate McGrath came up with the name in a meeting, spontaneously. And we put together very quickly and worked with the National Women's Law Center folks to put together the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, because it became clear, first of all, as more and more women were speaking out, through #MeToo that Tarana Burke had started years before and started sharing their stories. Well, those women started getting sued or threatened with lawsuit for defamation. So they needed legal support in that. And then we also learned there were thousands of low-wage women who, although usually if you have a claim for sexual harassment, you get your wages back and you can get attorney's fees. If your wages are really low, then your recovery in that kind of lawsuit's really low. And low-wage women can't find lawyers, right, to take their cases. So even though it's been 30 years since sexual harassment was outlawed by the federal government, 30 years later, there are thousands of low-wage women in particular, but lots of women up and down the wage scale who have been unable to find lawyers to take their cases. And so we created the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, Gratefully, the National Women's Law Center stepped up to run it because they are a well-established women's rights legal organization. They had the expertise. And that's what got launched, at the Golden Globes with Oprah Winfrey's amazing speech. We raised $24 million right away. It's, I think, one of the biggest fundraising campaigns GoFundMe has ever had. 100% of that $24 million went to the National Women's Law Center to operate the Legal Defense Fund. It has, in the last 2.5 years, served over 4,800 individuals and continued to go. And along the way, we also saw the need for an advocacy organization. So Time's Up Foundation and Time's Up Now were created, a 501c3 and a 501c4, to advocate for changes in laws and in companies and in our culture to help support sexual harassment survivors. But more than that, Rebecca and Kelly, because we know, we don't want to just deal with sexual harassment in the aftermath, right after it happens, and helping the survivors of that, but you want to stop it from even happening. And that really requires building better workplaces, right? Building better workplace culture. Mm-hmm. Very much what I was doing in my law practice, right? Is, how do you build structures that address the inherent inequalities in our workplaces, things like unequal pay and promotion practices and recruitment practices. And, that's what we're doing at Time's Up. And so I was sort of convinced. It wasn't something I really wanted to do, was to leave my legal practice, but I was convinced late last year to come over and become the full-time president and CEO at Time's Up Foundation and Time's Up Now. But one of the things I told them, the two of you will appreciate, was, okay, I don't want to move from Chicago, having now come home from my 8 years in DC. So we've opened a Chicago office in addition to our LA, New York, and DC offices. So I get to be here in Chicago when I'm not on the road.
It seems like now you can just work from everywhere anyway.
Really, I'd already been good at Zoom calls, and now I'm doing them a lot.
So one of the things, before we talk a little bit about the voting side of your work, I know that you've moved, as you pointed out, with the foundation and the C4, quite proactively into this area of advocacy as well as litigation. And if you could just kind of spell out for the listeners how they can get involved in that and be active participants while safely at home.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the easiest way to find out what we're doing and stay in touch with us is you can just text the word NOW, N-O-W, to 30644. So it's the word NOW, N-O-W, to 30644. And that will get you the links, to sign up for, our newsletter, for action alerts, to get the information that you need. Yeah, I mean, our what we say we're doing is, we want to build better workplace cultures through changing companies, culture, and laws, to really work with private sector employers, to work with public policymakers, to work with our overall culture, to create the change that we need to see in companies, to really build companies that have the values and are living out the values for their workers of safety and dignity and respect for everyone, for women workers, for LGBTQ, for disabled workers, for people of color. And not just because it's the right thing to do, but because I really do believe, though the workplaces that get this right are the workplaces that are going to succeed in the future. They're going to be stronger. They're going to be more resilient. It's addressing issues like equal pay. It's addressing issues like paid leave. In this current crisis, it's addressing issues like paid sick leave.
Right.
And one of the things we did early on in this crisis several weeks ago was realize that paid sick leave was going to be an issue. The United States is only one of 2 industrialized countries in the world that does not have a national paid sick leave policy. And it's such an illustration about why that issue is not just something to do when times are good. It's a fundamental, structural, foundational policy that we should have everywhere, right? Because if we'd had paid sick leave going into this crisis, then companies would have already built it into their business plans. Workers would have already known that they had paid sick leave to take. Workers would have started staying home when they were sick, early on in the crisis, and we'd collectively all be in a much better place. So that's why these workplace policies are so critical, not just for individual workers and their families, but for employers and for our economy and country as a whole.
I know that you've been involved in helping get women registered to vote. You're on the board of When We All Vote. Can you talk some about why, especially in this moment, it's important for us to think about making sure as many people are registered as possible and that people who are registered are voting? And of course, right now, one of the important things is finding ways to vote safely.
Oh, absolutely. These issues that we're talking about, a lot of it is made by public policy, right? The lack of a national paid sick leave policy. Congress just thankfully passed some protections, right, in the new CARES Act, but because of the, Republican pressure, put a lot of loopholes into it, like, the legislation that was just passed by Congress, exempted employers of over 500 workers. The new then, Trump administration Department of Labor regulations that came out just a few days ago put even greater loopholes in for small businesses and requirements that weren't even called for under the legislation that was signed into law. So that's just one example of how it's really important to look at what people's policies are and positions are as candidates, and as public policymakers on where they stand on these critical issues, because that's what really affects the kinds of policies that workers experience and whether they have workplaces that will support them when they're sick, that will provide protections for them if they're sexually harassed, that will give them fair and equal pay. We did, for example, through Time's Up Now, we collaborated on a town hall that you can, if you text 2020 to 30644, or you look on our website, timesupnow.org, you'll get a link to the town hall we held during the primary season with fortune.com that really asked all of the candidates at that time. There were many more than there are right now, but they're all the candidates in both parties for their positions on these issues of childcare and sexual harassment and equal pay for their policy positions. And we lay those all out there. And we ask everybody to make sure you're informed about the different policies the candidates have, because it makes a difference. And there are some stark differences between the candidates we head into this fall election. And it will really, really make a difference, and to be informed. And to also, it's so critical now to get registered and to make sure that people get to the polls. So When We All Vote is actually doing a collaboration with United States of Women, both of which are organizations that I am a part of, to make sure that women in particular are informed about the ways they can get registered to vote, and about the importance of turning out to vote, and the importance at the grassroots level of local races and at the national level. So it's so critical. So we actually have a gender equity voting collaborative, started as a coalition effort between When We All Vote and United States of Women, to really work with grassroots organizations across the country to make sure everyone is coordinated, everyone has the best-in-class tools available. When We All Vote has a great text messaging tool that we can use to get people the ability to get information about registering online, which is so important to do right now while we're practicing safe social distancing. And it's going to be important to be active in this as we head into the fall, so that we make sure that every state actually implements safe but also inclusive voting practices this fall.
On the voting matter, and I know you know this, Tina, we were sort of encouraged and decided to do this podcast because as a follow-up to my book, Vote Her In, about electing a first woman president. And obviously that's not going to happen in 2020, but I wonder whether you could just share from your standpoint, working on these voting projects, what you're seeing among the women that you're doing outreach to, and their interest in seeing more women elected, even in seeing a woman president.
So I think, we've seen just increasing activity since 2016 of women who understand the importance of voting, understand also how important any one vote can be if you look at the margins of victory in many of these key races and how close they are, and who have been inspired to vote themselves. So I think you can look at the 2018 midterm elections and the incredible number of women, including, for example, Lauren Underwood right here in Illinois,
right,
who aspired to run, who ran in districts where people thought they didn't have a chance, who were, inspired, the women and men in those districts, to see the importance of, women who understand the issues that average voters are experiencing in their own lives. And that includes significantly these issues that we're talking about today around working families and what, workers are experiencing in their own lives. And I expect that as we come out of this healthcare crisis and this economic crisis to be even more important to people this November, is to see candidates who understand the struggles that working families have and are responsive to those. And so I think, women voters are going to be looking for that. They're looking for women's leadership. You've also seen, in the last several weeks, how it's really been women leaders who've come forward,
right,
like Senator Patty Murray, like Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, like Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who have really pushed for these important protections in these recovery bills, like childcare and, like making sure unemployment insurance was expanded, for everyone. And it's going to be even more important as we go into the recovery period to keep those things front and center. And it will take, women using their voices. It's something that Time's Up is really focused on. We want to make sure people understand these issues of protecting workers, especially working families and working women, aren't just luxury items to do when times are good, but they are essential items to keep doubling down and investing in when times are bad, because that's what will build not just stronger individual workers, but they will build stronger companies and they will build a stronger and more resilient economy overall. But that really takes leadership, and it takes paying attention to, the leaders in both parties and what their positions are, and, to vote based on those issues.
I can't think of a better way to close this chat we have been having with Tina Tchen, and encouraging us to move forward, as one of our earlier guests encouraged us also to do, and focus on the issues of concern to women in bad times as well as good, or as hard, and working as hard as we can. So I want to thank you again, Tina, and I know Kelly would like to say thank you and any parting words from her.
Yes, absolutely, Tina. Thank you so much. And to everyone, hang in there. We will all keep moving forward. I think these are very hard times, but it's really shining a light on all of these issues of inequality and how we really need to take care of them.
Well said. Thank you so much, Tina.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening, off of the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.